All right, welcome back to Hoop Hierarchy. This is KC coming back to you with part two of the video series I'm doing on tier list when it comes to former NBA MVPs and how I think they would translate to the modern NBA. So I want to just go back over on how I'm classifying this. Um, I'm ranking all MVPs by how they would do in the modern NBA based on their play style, um, based on how they would translate to modern changes of rules, changes of offenses, things along those lines. Um, this is not if you just took the player, picked them up, and dropped them in the 2020s, kind of like I said in the last video. Um, but if they grew up in the modern day, have the same general skill set to players of the modern day, but also they keep their same style from when they played. Um, and like I said in the past video, this is not arguments to how good a player was. So if you think that I'm underrating a certain player over a different player, like if you think, for example, um, like say a certain player was clearly had a better career than another player that ends up on a lower tier, it's not based on how good the player actually was. It's based on how good they translate to the NBA today. So, with all that being said, I'm going to get right into this one. This one is going to be covering 1971 to 1987. So, kind of the period to where the NBA kind of hit a lull, kind of hit a dead period, and eventually started coming back into its own and growing once again due to a couple superstars later in the early to mid 80s that kind of brought the NBA back. So, starting it off, the first player I'm going to cover is the MVP of the 1970-1971 season and a multiple-time MVP, Kareem. So, Kareem is an interesting case here. He is in my top five players of all time. I think you're crazy if he's not in your top five players of all time. He's a consistent scoring machine, absolute dominant offensive force, especially in his prime years. He had some skills that would translate. A lot of his game was old-fashioned. For example, the skyhook really isn't used today due to the fact that it takes a lot of time to master that move, and there's other things that bigs work on today that they prefer to use. With that being said, the move would work. It was really basically an unguardable move and still would be today. Kareem had a top-tier mid-range shot. I believe that was good enough that in the modern NBA he'd probably be able to stretch it out to the three-point line. He was also an elite-tier shot blocker, especially in his younger days. But it was still a really good blocker in his later career too. He's unique in the way that yes, he was old-fashioned, but he was just so insanely good at it that the way he plays would work in today's game. No one has duplicated the skyhook, but I don't think anyone could guard it either. I'm of the opinion that the most dominant post players in history would still be dominant in any league they play in, even if their style doesn't fit as well. And Kareem's style does actually have some factors that would make it good today. Like he was pretty agile for a big. He was a good shooter. Still nobody stopping that skyhook, like I said. If I were to try to come up with a modern comparison, I guess the closest thing I could think of is Joel Embiid, but maybe like a bit quicker, even better defensively. But there's really not a one-for-one comparison to Kareem and how he plays. He was one of the better players in the NBA throughout his whole career. He would be one of the best players in the NBA today as well, if he grew up today. So for that reason, Kareem's going to go A tier for me. Next up is Dave Cowan. So he's a bit underrated as a player, but like I'll touch on it a bit later with the next player. A lot of the guys at this time were considered a bit underrated and are still considered a bit underrated. Cowens is definitely an example of that, just because of the way that the 70s were. But he was considered an all-round player for his time, which was pretty rare to see back in that day. You know, especially at the center position. You know, when researching, I found that this really exemplifies his all-around game. That there's only 5 other players who have led their teams in all 5 major statistical score categories for a season, being points, rebounds, assists, blocks, and steals. And Dave Cowens is one of them. The other players are Scottie Pippen, Kevin Garnett, LeBron, Giannis, Jokic. Okay, that's great company to be in when it comes to an all-round player, a player that really runs the whole offense and defense for a team. He was a good mid-range scorer. He was agile. He was a great rebounder, great passer. decent defender as well. In today's game, he fits the mold of the do-it-all style big man that has really grown in effectiveness and popularity. I see his assist numbers being higher in the modern day than they were back then because a lot of the teams now have their centers play make more than was the case in the 70s. Even if he could do it back then, they still were wanting to run the offense through the point guard. I think now with a less rigid game plan, kind of like they do today, everything's more free flowing today than it used to be. I think he would get a lot more assists. I actually think a really good comparison to what I think he would be like is maybe like Domantas Sabonis. Smaller but quicker, similar numbers, maybe even a bit better in the defensive end. I do not think Cowens would win the MVP in the modern day. I just think in that era it took a bit less to win it. I certainly don't think Cowens was ever quite as skilled as someone like Jokic is when it comes to an all-around game, especially on the scoring or playmaking end. But that being said, I do think if he played today with a similar but modernized skill set, he would be just about as good as he was at that time. So for me, Cowens is going to be A tier as well. Next up, we have Bob McAdoo. So some people may disagree with what I'm about to do here, but that's just because they aren't familiar with McAdoo's game. So he was obviously quite the player in his day. Anyone who is aware of his stats know that he did put up really good stats, but his major calling card was that he was a phenomenal shooter for a big man, really when that wasn't as much of a thing. He even had his coach at Buffalo try to force him to play small forward due to his shooting and on-ball ability, because at the time, that didn't really fit a center as well as it does today. NBA.com still cites it as one of the best shooting big men of all time. And in the middle of the 1975-76 season, Sports Illustrated was calling McAdoo the quickest tall man, finest shooter, and most astounding outside scoring machine to ever play basketball. So that is very high praise. Back then, especially. A lot of the players that were big in the 70s are forgotten by history to some degree because that was, probably other than the earliest days of basketball, the most dead time for the leagues. They were on the verge of collapse for various reasons. But that really shouldn't take away how good guys like McAdoo were. He was also an elite defender. He averaged over a block and a steal per game almost the entirety of his prime. His main criticism, if there is one, is that his prime wasn't that long. He only played at his best for about 6 seasons. I would argue with modern medical advancements that probably could be lengthened. McAdoo today, I think he would be more than likely the premier stretch big / scorer at his position, whether it be power forward or center. I think he is probably just purely one of the best big men when it comes to translation ability to the modern day. It's hard for me to think of a comparison because he had a bit of LeBron to him almost, which is kind of crazy to think of. I obviously don't think he would be quite that level, and he wasn't quite that playmaker, but he was just a great, great scorer in that sense as well. I think McAdoo would translate really well to the league today. I'm going to say McAdoo is going to go into the S tier for me, which, like I said, might sound crazy, but I think his game translates insanely well. So, next up, Bill Walton. So, Bill Walton, it's very interesting, actually. You wouldn't think that there'd be so many players that would translate to the modern NBA from back then, but honestly, here's my theory with that. While there are more good players now, the players who were transcendent type guys that won the MVP, I think those guys would be talented in any era they were born in because they just have something to them, whether it be skill, physical gifts, or intelligence that puts them far and above others who have played in any era. I think Walton is one of those examples, obviously. Very skilled big man before injuries killed his career. Walton did it all, kind of like I said with Dave Cowens mentioned beforehand, except slightly more traditional than what Dave Cowens was. Walton was bigger, making him an absolute force on the defensive end, averaging near 3 blocks for the majority of his prime, as short as it was. He could pass. He had shooting range. He was mainly a force on the boards, though. I do still think he'd be prone to injury, as I think he was simply predisposed to be that way. But during his prime, I don't really want to compare another big to Sabonis like I did earlier with Dave Cowens, or even Jokic. But I think those are pretty similar comparisons to Walton as well. I think he's going to be A tier because he translates pretty well as a modern big. Like I said, he's not exactly like Dave Cowens, but they had some similarities to where I think that they would kind of translate on a similar level. Cowens being a little bit more of a playmaker, Walton being a little bit more of a traditional inside scorer, rebounder type guy. Um, Next up, Moses Malone. So Moses Malone, for what it's worth, one of the most underrated players of all time. He was an extremely dominant force on the inside, and I believe he is the greatest rebounder in history, personally. I think is the thing about Malone, he was the perfect player for his era. He doesn't necessarily have a game that translates to today. He has a small hit of a mid-range shot. He could shoot it a little bit. But I think the majority of his game was formulated around just pure strength, skill, working around the rim. I think in today's game, he'd make shots consistently in the mid-range, but I doubt he would have been able to stretch that jumper to the three-point line. Malone more than likely would have had a bit of a similarity to his game. Kind of like Andre Drummond, I think, like prime Andre Drummond. Probably, almost certainly a better version of that. He was a rebounding force, dominant inside, but unfortunately that game has kind of gotten phased out. He's probably an all-star, but he's almost certainly not a three-time MVP like he was. So for that, I'm going to be putting Moses Malone in the C tier. Next up, Dr. J. So I do think Dr. J would fit in the modern league. I just think he was probably built a bit better for the 70s, 80s type era. Basically, he was the man that saved basketball in the 70s and 80s. If I was making this list on how well a player would fit in like the mid-2000s, he'd be easily A tier. I think the game has morphed into such a focus around three-point shooting as opposed to the ISO mid-range scorers that were kind of the thing at that time, that I don't think his game is quite ideal for today's archetype. He was one of the best athletes to ever play. Had an elite mid-range that I'm sure would become the occasional three today, and he just made stuff happen on the court. Not really much more to say about Dr. J. He would still be an elite scorer, I'm sure. My closest comparison in style, I think he would play a lot like DeMar DeRozan. He'd be bigger. I think he'd be quite a bit better. I do still think that a modern Dr. J would be one of the best scorers and players in general in the modern league, but I do believe because he fits in a bit worse than he did in his era, I'm going to say B tier for Dr. J. So next up, Larry Bird. So I feel like Larry is a guy that everyone talks about when the conversation is about which older guys fit perfectly in the modern league. And I think that's for good reason when it comes to Larry. He had a very modern game to him. He was a fantastic scorer on all levels. He was very crafty around the rim, one of the best mid-range jumpers of all time, had arguably the best three-point shot of his era. He was an elite passer, not quite as elite as his main rival in Magic Johnson, but he was still one of the best passers in the league, especially as a small forward. He was also really good as a defender, which surprises some people who seem to have the false impression that Larry couldn't really guard anyone. Really, his only weakness is probably his quickness, but that doesn't really hurt him that much in this time, because as we see with Luka and Jokic, quickness isn't the be-all, end-all in the modern NBA to be considered great, especially when you have some of the traits that guys like Larry have. Speaking of Luka, that's kind of the easy comparison for Bird, but I've been thinking, and I don't really think that's a one-for-one match. Luka has a lot of James Harden-type ISO handles, step-backs that Bird didn't really employ as much. But I do think what they have as far as similarities, intelligence, passing ability, pure offensive creativity. I think Larry would be a mix of some of those traits from Luka, along with like a similar scoring at three levels type prowess of like a Kevin Durant, because what Larry and KD have in common is they usually like make their move and take the shot. They don't mess around with like the ISO type crossovers, sizing up. They make their move quick and they find their spot and they get a bucket. They're efficient in that way. Regardless, Bird would be easily in the MVP contention today's game, right at the top of the best small forwards in the game. I'm going to say Larry is S tier. Even as great as Larry was in his time, winning multiple MVPs, his game fits better in today's era. He could better utilize his shooting range, I would say. The way that we play today, he would hit a whole lot more threes. While it's hard to say if he'd win as many MVPs as he did back then, certainly not out of the question. He'd be perennially right at the top of every conversation. Larry Bird's going to be S tier. Next up, and the last one for this video, Magic Johnson. So Magic isn't quite ideal for this era, but that does not mean he wouldn't be a great player either. He was just so good that I believe his style would work, and he'd easily be the best passer in the league because he was the best passer of all time and the hub of any offense. Magic quite simply lived up to his name. He was Magic on the court. In 1982, Magic averaged 18, 9.6, and 9.5 on less than half the usage rate that Russell Westbrook got in 2017. He would legitimately be a yearly threat to average a triple-double with like 15 assists a game. His main flaw when it comes to being modern NBA ready is his inconsistent, quite frankly below average jump shot, especially compared to modern shooters. His form is a little odd, so I really don't think that he would become a consistent shooter in any era. But that being said, I think there's been numerous guards in the league recently, like the aforementioned Russell Westbrook, probably being the most notable example. And we did get a couple of good Ben Simmons years in there before he fell apart, who have had the ability to be elite without a good jump shot. I think Magic would be the pinnacle of that. I think it's hard to make a modern comparison because there's really no one exactly like him. I'm going to say that he'd be some type of mixture of a Russell Westbrook with the well-roundedness of his game, great rebounding, inside-oriented offense, do-it-all point guard style, but kind of a lack of jumper, but with the efficiency on offense of a guy kind of like Tyrese Halliburton has. Like I said earlier, he doesn't really fit the style of today, but his skill set was so unique that I think he would make himself fit in. So for that reason, Magic Johnson is going to go A tier. So that will conclude this video when it comes to ranking MVPs on how they would translate to the modern NBA. Anyone who stuck around for the entire video, I want to say I appreciate you sticking through. Like I said, this is a video series. There's going to be a couple of more videos to fit into the series, at least 2. I'm going to stretch it probably into the kind of the early 2010s. I don't know if I'm going to do a video on the guys of the 2010s and the 2020s because they're all still playing. There's really no point because obviously they translate to the modern NBA. They play in the modern NBA. But so, like I said, I appreciate you guys sticking around. There's going to be more videos to come. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like this content here. But yeah, I appreciate you guys sticking around and hope you enjoyed.